And we've had Nina speak once before with us several years ago on a book that she wrote called The Lowells of Massachusetts, An American Family, which came out in 2017. She gave a wonderful talk on that, and we're delighted to have her back with us. Nina's also the author of 2 other books, Tolstoy and the Purple Chair, and also Signed, Sealed, and Delivered. She attended and graduated from Tufts University and also Harvard Law School. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nina Sankovitch.
Thank you, Miriam. And thank you everyone who's here today, joining me virtually. I really want to thank the Belmont Library and Miriam and Corinne for setting up our meeting so that I could talk to you today about my new book, American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution. This is a totally new way to do book talks, to talk about my books with readers. And I hope I'm getting better at it. At least the great thing is I'm able to do a slideshow to be able to really give you some visuals as I sort of the ideas that come out in American Rebels, the stories of these 3 families, and just parallels that I find between what we're going through today and what the American Rebels went through at the end of the 18th century. On February 22nd, 1770, Christopher Sider, an 11-year-old boy, was shot and killed on the streets of Boston. The man who shot him was Ebenezer Richardson, a former customs informer and a loyalist to King George. Richardson had come to the aid of his neighbor. Let me get a slide up here. There we go. Come to the aid of his neighbor, Theophilus Lilly, who owned a store which sold British goods. Now the colonists at that time were boycotting British goods. And so there were gangs of little boys who would harass shop owners, literally paint over their signs, throw dung at them, snowballs, break the windows of their stores, do everything they could to really harass and really put fear into people who were siding with the British over the importation of British goods. So Lilly was being harassed by a group of young boys for selling imported British goods, and Richardson stepped in to help him. And as soon as he stepped in to help him, and a crowd had formed by this time, the boys turned their attention to Richardson, and throwing stones at him and snowballs, they chased him back to his house. Richardson went into his home, ran up to the 3rd floor, threw open the windows of the attic, and took wild shots from his shotgun down into the crowd. You can see that. I'm going to use my pointer. You can see here the shooting from the attic down into the crowd. A piece of shot struck Christopher Sider, killing him. All of Boston was tormented by the death of this child. And Sam Adams, together with his Sons of Liberty, planned a full-blown funeral for the young Sider. Now, despite the snow, hail, thunder, and lightning that tormented the mourners that day, it was just a day of crazy weather in Boston that day, close to 3,000 people turned out for the funeral. They came together on the streets of Boston in part to lament the death of this child, and in part to protest oppressive British policies in the Massachusetts colony, and particularly in its largest town, Boston. The funeral of Christopher Sider was not the first time the patriots of Boston turned out to protest British oppressions, nor would it be the last. Having studied the protest movements that led to the American Revolution, I see many parallels between what the rebels were fighting for then and what protesters today are marching for. The men and women who fanned the flames of the American Revolution, and who I write about in my book, American Rebels, would understand the motivations behind the protests going on now. After all, the core complaints which drive Americans to the streets today are many of the same ones which drove the American rebels to the streets in the 1760s and 70s. Brutality of occupying troops, restriction of liberties, failure to protect one's safety in his or her own home and community, militarization of police forces, lack of accountability of the police forces, undermining of the judicial system, attacking the press and restricting press activity, warrantless searches. These are all reasons why protesters are marching now and why the American rebels made the difficult and dangerous decision to rise up against England and fight for independence. I have long been fascinated by the question of how the American colonists came to the decision to rebel against England. I mean, how did they have the courage to break with a country that was known for its awesome naval powers, its military commanders, its empire building and empire crushing abilities? I also wondered, how did the choice to rebel, to make that momentous decision to rebel, how did that decision cut across class lines and across gender lines? And so in the summer of 2016, I began looking for a community to study in which men and women of different classes and backgrounds work together towards independence. Through a total twist of luck, I came upon a 100-year-old book written by a quirky minister and historian named Daniel Monroe Wilson. In the book, he described his adopted town of Braintree, Massachusetts, and I will quote from that book now. In the aspirations and heroisms of that little community of Braintree, independence began. Few towns can boast of history more brightly colored, not only with deeds of patriots, but with the surprises of romance. Not only with the sturdy enterprises of plain liberty-loving farmers, but with the debonair discourse of the colonial gentility. Well, I was hooked by these words. I mean, independence, patriots, romance, liberty-loving farmers, and gentility. I had found my village to study. And when I discovered just who Monroe was referring to in his descriptions of young men and women, patriots, romantics, farmers, and gentility, I was simply blown away to find out that from this one small village of Braintree came some of the best known leaders of the American Revolution, and also a forgotten hero of the Revolution. So let me introduce them. Well, of course, you all know, let's go back, John Hancock. He was born in Braintree, the first son of the Reverend John Hancock. Not only was he the son of a preacher, but also the grandson of one. Hancock most likely would have become a preacher himself, but for the intervention of his uncle, and perhaps even more importantly, his aunt, Thomas and Lydia Hancock, who adopted him after the death of his father in 1744. You know John Adams, of course, and are most likely familiar with his ambitions to greatness, not only for his colony, but for himself. What you may not know is that Adams was also born in Braintree, was a childhood friend of John Hancock, and that he had a passionate romance with a young woman from Braintree who was the cousin of the woman he ended up marrying, Abigail Smith. Now, Abigail Smith, who became Abigail Adams, spent a good deal of her childhood in, you guessed it, Braintree. She stayed with her grandmother Quincy, a woman who appreciated Abigail's wit and energy. For as she described it, wild colts make the best horses. Let me also introduce Dorothy Quincy, known as Dolly. She also grew up in Braintree and would become the wife of John Hancock, but only after a very long courtship. She had known both wealth and deprivation in her life, and she was determined to forge her own path, independent for herself, but committed to the welfare of her community. There is One last rebel I want to introduce you to today, Josiah Quincy Junior. He was called the Patriot in his lifetime, and he was called by this name because he was, no holds barred, the most impassioned and impassioning political writer and orator of his time. He was also a sought-after lawyer. In fact, he was the lead lawyer for the British Captain Thomas Preston and his soldiers in the Boston massacre trials. John Adams assisted in the defense, but it was Josiah Quincy whom the British asked for first, because Josiah was known throughout the colony as the best lawyer in Boston. Why did Quincy and Adams, staunch patriots and American rebels, why did they agree to represent the British accused of murdering American colonists? To prove that the colonists of Massachusetts were law-abiding, that they respected the rights to counsel and trial and representation as guaranteed under British law, and that they were deserving of having their colonial rights restored to them as required under British law. In the end, Captain Preston and 5 of his soldiers were found not guilty, and 2 were convicted of manslaughter, convicted to be branded on the hand. Josiah Quincy Jr. was also a diplomat who traveled far and wide seeking American unity, prosperity, and peace, despite his crippling health issues. I'll talk more about his health and his diplomacy later. When I wrote American Rebels, I, of course, could have had no idea of the pandemic that would ravage the world this spring, nor of the massive protests following the death of George Floyd. In the past few weeks, we have seen political, community, social action like never before. But maybe not quite like never before. The actions undertaken by the American rebels to secure their freedoms were also massively progressive, bold, and potentially dangerous. I am not going to attempt to draw parallel after parallel in today's talk, but if you read my book with an eye toward such parallels, I promise you, you will find them. Already 8 years before independence was declared, Josiah Quincy Jr. wrote a letter to a friend about his growing disillusionment with the British government. The letter resonates with how so many Americans feel today. And I'll quote the letter. "To see the daily blunders which are committed and the deep tragedy which is now acting on the political theater, and not to be moved, is to be an unfeeling wretch indeed. If the contempt and indignation of every sensible and humane man in Christendom were sufficient to explode a political system, there would be some hopes of seeing Venice preserved and the plot discovered." What does this mean? Venice preserved and the plot discovered. Well, Quincy was referring to the growing oppressions imposed on the colonists by Parliament and King George, and the final line about Venice preserved concerns a popular 17th century play criticizing the politics of tyranny. In other words, if contempt and indignation were enough to topple a system of oppression, the system would be long gone, for the American colonists were fed up, and the flames of rebellion were starting to flicker and grow. As England tightened its fists on the American colonies by subverting the courts, condemning free press, prohibiting peaceful meetings, flooding Boston with occupying troops, offering immunity from colonial justice to British agents, attempting to enter and secure private properties for their own purposes, as well as executing warrantless searches and instituting juryless trials, the flames of rebellion grew hotter, brighter, wider, until they burst into armed uprising, and ultimately rebellion. As Patriot Josiah Quincy wrote already in 1772, "One and all ought to arise and overturn, and continue to overturn until they leave not a wreck of their bondage behind." On the eve of the Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773, the men and women of Boston were called to the Old South Meeting House to discuss what should be done about the Tea Act. The Tea Act had been recently passed by Parliament, and it granted the East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. In defiance of orders prohibiting such meetings, over 7,000 people came to the Old South Meeting House to hear the rebel leaders speak about the Tea Act, as well as more moderate speakers. There was going to be a debate about what to do about the Tea Act. In the end, the determination was made that there could be no compromise over the act. The English Parliament must be sent a clear message that the oppressions of colonial freedoms would not be tolerated, and the tea of the East India Company, a symbol of British oppression, must be destroyed. Josiah Quincy spoke at the meeting at the Old South. Frequently ill as a child, he'd been diagnosed with consumption in his early 20s. He now announced his illness to the gathered crowd. The diagnosis of his consumption had previously been unknown. He now announced it to the crowd. He then said that he used his consumption as a spur to achieve as much as he could before he died. As he said, "The seeds of dissolution are thickly planted in my constitution. They must soon ripen. I feel how short is the day that is allotted to me." He encouraged everyone there in the meeting house to seize the day and take action to preserve American rights and liberties. Josiah then offered the final benediction before the men and women gathered in the meeting house left to go to the harbor to take care of the hated tea. He said, "I see the clouds which now rise thick and fast upon our horizon. The thunders roll and the lightnings play. To that God who rides on the whirlwind and directs the storm, I commit my country." All in all, it took about 60 men, little more than 3 hours, to destroy 342 chests and throw 46 tons, 92,000 pounds of tea into the frigid waters of Boston Harbor. For many, this is the starting point of the American Revolution. Parliament responded to the Boston Tea Party with yet another act aimed to crush the spirit and the economy of the Massachusetts colony. The Port of Boston was to be shut down until full reparations for the dumped tea was made, and even more British troops would be sent to Boston to enforce the blockade. Just 4 days after news of the Boston Port Act arrived in America, Josiah Quincy published an 80-page pamphlet critiquing the act. Josiah beseeched his fellow colonists to acknowledge the insidious arts and detestable practices used to deceive, disunite, and enslave the good people of this continent. And he warned them that the extirpation of bondage and the reestablishment of freedom are not of easy acquisition. Trials and conflicts you must endure. Hazards and jeopardies of life and fortune will attend the struggle. But he also reminded them that nothing glorious is accomplished, nothing great is attained, nothing valuable is secured without magnanimity of mind and devotion of heart to service. Dedicate yourselves, he said, at this day to the service of your country, and henceforth live a life of liberty and glory. The printed pamphlet was distributed throughout the colonies, inflaming all who read it, infuriating the loyalists, and encouraging patriots. Instead of crushing the colonial uprising, the Boston Port Act brought new and united resolve to all of the American colonies. In the fall of 1774, the Continental Congress began meeting, with 12 colonies sending representatives. Josiah Quincy had understood early on the importance of union between the 13 American colonies. In 1773, he made a trip to the southern colonies with the express purpose of forming alliances between North and South. Let's get a map of the... He knew that Southern concerns were distinct from those of the Northerners. Their economies were different. Religion was treated in a different way. And the courts and the administrative offices in each colony were different. And yet Josiah was sure that he could bring Southerners and Northerners together and join the purpose of liberty. As he wrote in a letter to a friend, "Let us forgive each other's follies and unite while we may. To think justly is not sufficient, but we must think alike before we shall form a union. And once that union is truly formed, we are invincible." Josiah's first stop on his journey south was Charleston. Now, the rich and powerful men of Charleston quickly warmed to Josiah. I mean, after all, he appeared to be one of their own. He was rich, he was savvy, cultured, interested in good food and good wine. Josiah, however, silently disapproved of many of the activities in which the Southerners he met engaged. Cards, dice, the bottle, and horses engrossed prodigious portions of time and attention, he wrote in his diary. As a Yankee New Englander, he was appalled by these practices. He was also thoroughly scandalized by how attendance at church in the South appeared to be yet another occasion for socializing, not as the serious commitment to contemplation that church-going was in Congregationalist New England. As he observed, in the South, the Sabbath is a day of visiting and mirth, of license and frolic. Nevertheless, Josiah was heartened by meeting up with scores of active patriots, men he described as hot and zealous in the cause of America. Josiah saw evidence of a sincere desire on the part of the Southern patriots to unite with their Northern counterparts. And ultimately, as Josiah traveled from the South back north, he was able to form strong relationships with a number of men who would later play such vital roles at the meetings of the Continental Congress. Those alliances would come into play and would lead to the signing of the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. Now, one aspect of Southern life and culture which Josiah abhorred and which he predicted would prove to be an obstacle for national unity was slavery. He was horrified by its prevalence in the South and disgusted by its acceptance by so many Southern leaders and politicians. Josiah saw the treatment of slaves as indications of Southern hypocrisy. There is much, he wrote this in his journal, there is much among this people of what the world would call hospitality and politeness, but it may be questioned what proportion there is of true humanity, Christian charity, and love. He feared that the necessary eradication of slavery would be difficult, with great opposition from the South. He predicted resentment, wrath, and rage between North and South over slavery, and he wrote, "Slavery may truly be said to be the peculiar curse of this land." Josiah Quincy would set out on one more journey of diplomacy before the Revolution began. This one was to England, and a last-ditch effort to convince the king that the colonists' complaints were legitimate, that they did not seek war or independence, but just their rights. They only wanted their rights under the British Constitution restored to them. But unlike the successes Josiah had experienced during his journey to the Southern colonies, in England, Josiah found little support among parliamentary leaders for the American position, and the king refused to entertain his proposals for reconciliation between the colonies and the mother country. Disillusioned with the king and with Parliament, and certain now that war was necessary and imminent, Josiah headed back to America in March of 1775. Despite the resurgence of consumption which had plagued him throughout the winter, and despite the urgings of Ben Franklin, who had become Josiah's good friend in London, that he not travel until he was in better health, well, Josiah was determined to make the journey home as soon as possible. Why? Why the urgency to get home? Well, he wrote in his diary about a secret message he carried from the few English allies he had met, a message that could help the rebels in their fight for their rights. As he wrote in his diary, "They insist upon my going directly to Boston. They say no letters can go with safety. I can deliver more information and advice viva voce than could or ought to be wrote. My going now will be of great advantage to the American cause." Josiah's ship came within view of the American coast on April 26, 1775. He knew nothing of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, fought 7 days earlier, and had no idea that the colonial militiamen had held their own against the British, and that the path to war was now inevitable. So, did Josiah make it to land to deliver his secret message? Did he fulfill his final mission before dying from the illness that had plagued him his whole life? You'll have to read American Rebels to find out. Following the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Abigail Adams wrote to a friend that England was no longer fit to rule over the colonies, not because of how they had fared on the fields of Lexington and Concord, but because they had fired on their fellow citizens. "O Britain, she wrote, how is thy glory vanished? How are thy annals stained with the blood of thy children?" Do we see a parallel between then and now? Let me share a quote with you from a pamphlet written in part by Josiah Quincy and John Adams in 1772, a tract called the Boston Pamphlet. This was another one of these tracts that was dispersed widely around all the colonies and did much to rally support for the rebel cause. And this is a quote from that pamphlet. "Let us disappoint the men who are raising themselves in the ruin of this country. Let us convince every invader of our freedom that we will be as free as the Constitution will justify." So much of what I write about in American Rebels is relevant to our current situation, not only politically, but also with how the rebels suffered through terrible epidemics, how they received conflicting news reports, how they remained isolated from friends with letters taking weeks and even months to arrive, how they suffered deprivations in the present and uncertainties as to what the future might hold. A reader of my book described how I take big figures from history and make them small, bring them down to the human dimension. And that's true. That's because the American rebels were human with weaknesses as well as strengths. But there is no doubt that they were also heroes who put community first, never losing their sense of duty and integrity and discovering unexpected stores of both mercy and courage. In closing, I just want to say that the path to revolution was not so clear or simple as many of us were taught in school. There were disagreements, arguments, full-blown fights over which was the right way to go, to rebel or to capitulate. There was uncertainty and lots of fear. There was debate and compromise. There was hard-headed determination on all sides. And for those who decided to rebel, they put everything on the line. Their lives, their fortunes, their futures, all in the hopes of securing liberties and justice and guaranteed rights for their communities. The immensity of their sacrifices and the great losses they endured only amplifies how much they valued doing what was right for the world in which they lived. I'll finish up with a quote from Josiah Quincy Junior, written to encourage his fellow patriots to endure through the hardships and uncertainties of their times. I'm sure we can find some encouragement ourselves from his words. May you have the fortitude to suffer, courage to encounter, and activity and perseverance to press forward. I wish for all of us fortitude, courage, activity, and perseverance. Thank you. And I am happy to take questions now from anybody out there.
Thank you very much, Nina. Does anybody have any questions for Nina? I'd like to ask you a couple, Nina.
Sure.
First, could you just talk a little bit about your research for this book?
Yeah, well, it was a lot. My research really began at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. I received a fellowship called the Thomas Friedlander Fellowship, which funded me to spend a lot of time in their archives, going through all of their records. And that's where I first found the Daniel Monroe Wilson book, and where I found so many records of the Adams family, the Quincy family, the Hancock family. And then, of course, I went to other historical societies and reviewed their records, the Cambridge Historical Society, here in Connecticut, the Fairfield Historical Society. And I also, probably the most enjoyable part, was going to actual site visits, going to the Quincy Homestead, which is now in Quincy, Mass. And Josiah Quincy's home is also there, his father's home, and the home that his son would end up growing up in. Josiah had spent very little time there, the Josiah that I spoke about in my speech. But the house is there, and it's furnished with furnishings that are original to the home. I also, of course, went to the John Adams homes, the John Adams Historical Park, which is an incredible place to visit. And everywhere that I went, I took notes, because I do my research taking notes. I don't record things on my computer. I do take some pictures. I do, of course, scan documents, but anything that I want to remember, I have to write down. So everything goes down sort of on loose leaf paper. Then everything was transferred into notebooks that I have. These are my notebooks, for example. These are just some of them. And then everything in the notebooks gets transferred onto note cards. And I have a series of about 20 poster boards where I arrange all of my note cards so that I can make sure that I'm covering everything that I want to cover, that I have correctly, documented that every date, every letter, every weather condition, everything that I write about is factual, and I have to make sure that I have the proof of it. And I do. It's all in my note cards. It's all in my research, and I want to keep track of it as I'm writing. And sometimes when I was writing the book, I would kind of lose track of where I was going. Then I would go back to my poster boards and find myself back on track. And that's how I came up with my structure for the book, which really, Tinder, Spark, Flame are the three sections of my book. And the idea is that first there had to be sort of a growing, and this is what I found in my research, it's this growing disapproval of how the British were treating American colonists. The colonists were starting to bridle a little bit at the controls and felt like their freedoms were being taken away. As those grew, as the oppressions grew, and as the violence grew, and as more and more troops were sent to Boston especially, then really there was a spark of all these sort of moldering discontents into something bigger. And then, of course, when compromise and reconciliation could not be reached with England and with the Crown, then there was the flame of rebellion. So my research was lengthy. I'll put this back there. Fascinating. I could write 10 more books about these families because I have so much information. I mean, Josiah Quincy really deserves a book of his own. Abigail Adams, of course, we all love her. She's amazing. I was very surprised to learn so much about Dorothy Quincy and really what a strong woman she was. I found out so much more about John Hancock than I had ever known, and about John Adams too. And they're just such a wonderful record of John Adams and Abigail Adams' letters and diaries, which are just such a good source of information about the years leading up to the American Revolution.
That's really fascinating. I also wanted to ask you, which contemporary historians do you enjoy reading, and which of them had the greatest influence on your own style of writing history?
Wow, that's a great question. I've never been asked that. I really like John Meacham. I had the pleasure of meeting him at our local library here in Westport, Connecticut. And he just brings, he's just a very good storyteller as well as a very sound historian, which is what I aim to be as well. A good storyteller, but also, you know, firmly founded in history and in facts. I like Jill Lepore from Harvard, who's written just all over the map about different topics. She had a wonderful book about Ben Franklin's sister that was very influential, just how she really gets into the sort of the daily life of people living in very turbulent times. And so much of what we learn in history classes and from so many history books are sort of the big moments, the big battles, the big meetings, but it is the daily life lived by the people of those times that I find so fascinating, because I see how much we are similar to those people. They were people just like us. They were enduring difficult times. They made some momentous decisions. And I find all of that really, really inspirational. And then of course, David McCullough, you know, everybody likes to read David McCullough. Again, he's a good storyteller. And that's what I always want to be, is a good storyteller. My books can read like a novel. And I find that to be a good thing, that's how we really become engaged in history. Although my books may read like a novel, they are factual and everything I have in them is documented. But I wanted to read not like a stiff textbook assigned in your, you know, US AP class in high school, but really like a riveting read that you can't put down, hopefully.
That's great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask?
So we did have one asked in the chat. Can you say a little bit more about Dolly Dorothy, who married John Hancock? What was she like?
Yeah, well, she was a very interesting character in that she was the youngest of all the children of Edmund Quincy and Elizabeth Quincy. And she, when the couple began having children, they were of modest means. The mother even ran a store out of her home. By the time Dorothy came along, they'd accumulated more wealth, and in 1748 they actually accumulated a huge amount of wealth when a ship was taken control of in the Atlantic, which had a huge treasure, a huge Spanish treasure. It was a huge Spanish treasure ship and a tiny ship owned by Quincy and Jackson, which was a firm that just did trading. They were not in the business of privateering, of, you know, pirating other ships, but they came upon this Spanish treasure ship, and because there were hostilities at the time between England and Spain, they had the right to, if they could, capture the ship, which they did, and it brought them just so much money, so much wealth. So for a long time, well, not a long time, actually, the wealth only lasted about 10 years, but during those 10 years, Dorothy Quincy led a life of luxury. Then the money disappeared, homes had to be sold, libraries, books and books and books, whole entire libraries had to be sold, and the family went back to more modest living. I think that had a major impact on Dolly and on her relationship with John Hancock, who fell in love with her and pursued her for years before she consented to marry him. I think she really wanted to, I mean, he was wealthy and his wealth wasn't going anywhere, but it wasn't just wealth she was looking for. She was looking for stability. And he was a very dynamic, charismatic young man who grew into a dynamic and charismatic leader of the American Revolution. And I think Dolly just really wanted to make sure that she would be entering into a stable relationship. And he would write her these letters after letters claiming he loved her and he wanted to see her. And she would write him back like 2 lines like, oh, good, nice to know. So she really played it cool. And the summer of 1775, she was staying in Fairfield, Connecticut, very close to where I live. And by chance, Aaron Burr came by and they began to spend a lot of time together. Now, Lydia Hancock, John Hancock's aunt, she was also staying in Fairfield, and she saw that something might be brewing between Aaron Burr, who was, you know, a good 7 to 10 years younger than Dorothy Hancock. She saw something might might be happening. So she made sure he got sent on his way, and she made sure John Hancock made his way up to Fairfield as soon as he could. And they were married finally in Fairfield in August of 1775. After which they scooted back down to Philadelphia, where Dolly Hancock became basically an unpaid secretary to the Continental Congress. She performed many tasks, which so many people don't know about, but which I was able to find out about. And hopefully I can bring to her some stature in American history, because she really did have a role to play in fanning the flames of revolution.
We have another question in the chat box here. It says, in the drawing you showed of the Boston Tea Party, there were Native Americans portrayed. Do you know much about what role they played at this time?
Well, in that picture, it's actually British American colonists dressed as American Indians. And the reason why so often the rebels chose to dress, especially as Mohawk Indians, was because during the 7 Years' War, which was a war that England fought with many other countries on the continent of Europe, but also in America in the French and Indian War, the Mohawk Indians had the reputation of being the toughest, hardiest, smartest fighters. And so when the American rebels wanted to take on the persona of being tough, smart, ready for battle, they dressed as Mohawk Indians. It was both to take on the persona and to put fear into anyone who saw them. And for the Boston Tea Party, it was also a disguise, so that any British officers who witnessed the Boston Tea Party would not be able to identify who were the men involved. And in fact, to this day, there are competing lists of who were the men involved, but no one is really sure of who were all the men involved. There are some who think John Hancock was one of the men. He wasn't. I'm sure he wasn't, nor was Paul Revere, in my opinion. But because they were dressed as Mohawks, it was a form of disguise. Now, in my book, American Rebels, I do talk about alliances that were built in 1775 between the Continental Congress and representatives of various Native American communities. And John Hancock was especially revered by many of these Native American communities and given a special name by them. So they were made many promises in the lead up to the American Revolutionary War. We know how many of those promises fell out after the war, but it is interesting to read about their relationships in how they actually offered advice on a 3-branch form of government versus a 2-branch form of government in coming up with what was going to happen after the revolution.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any chat questions people would like to write in, or live questions? Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up then. But thank you very much, Nina, for sharing all your thoughts on the book. It's a fascinating book, and you gave a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. And I want to also thank all of you attendees for participating on this Zoom conference. And it's a difficult time for everyone because we can't meet in person, but it's great that we can meet via this format of Zoom. So thanks again, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.